change. She also did some interesting genetic work on looking at the role of genetic variation and how that may constrain populations from adapting on the range edge. And that's obviously really important to climate change. From here, she went on to do a postdoc at University of Central Florida, where she again did some really interesting modeling work, which she's going to share with you today. I'm looking at climate impacts on basically, are they green turtles or sea turtles? Both.
Loggerhead and
loggerhead sea turtles. Their nesting success on beaches and how climate change may impact that. And then she's going to talk about some of her most recent work, which is more qualitative, actually. It comes from kind of a review perspective, looking at ways to assess the vulnerability of wildlife to climate change. And so I'll let Marta take it away in that.
Great, thanks, Ken. And thank you all for coming. You'll have to bear with me as I try to remember to advance 2 PowerPoints at once, and feel free to interrupt me at any point to ask questions. It'll give me and my lungs a nice little break. So like Ken said, let's see if I can get this to advance too. There you go. So like Ken said, I'm going to talk through a couple of different projects today, starting with my postdoc research, which was on sea turtles and nesting success in the southeastern US. And then some of my current work with the US Geological Survey and US Fish and Wildlife Service. And these projects share some similarities in terms of kind of questions and management and climate change. There are also some really key differences that have required some very different approaches to working through this. So I'm going to get started with my my postdoc work on sea turtles in the southeastern US. So I did this work starting in 2018 with Doctors Betsy Von Holly and John Weishample at the University of Central Florida. So I was a postdoctoral fellow, and they hired me specifically to work on this National Park Service funded grant to investigate the effects of sea level rise and urban growth on sea turtle nesting to enhance management on southeastern coastal parks. And they hired me because of the work I had done with Ken here at the University of Minnesota, doing biophysical niche modeling for mountaintop salamanders in the southern Appalachians. So the grant that Betsy and John had written kind of loosely detailed that they are going to do biophysical niche modeling of all the sea turtles and exactly how their nesting was going to change in the future. This is what we did for salamanders. Salamanders live very simple, very well-studied lives. So we have a good mechanistic understanding of how temperature affects kind of every moment of their lives, from how much they forage to how efficiently they forage to their reproductive output. So we had used that to model where on the landscape there would be future suitable habitat. Now, sea turtles are a little bit more complicated. So this is just like a very simple snapshot of how climate change, which is kind of the blue boxes or circles, could potentially affect nesting outcomes through kind of these other mechanisms, bring in humans. And you'll notice that there are some arrows that go off the screen, because this is only thinking about a very small part of their life cycle. As we know, sea turtles are out in the open ocean doing all kinds of things and disappearing. So not only is this a much more complicated figure, but when we're thinking about something that has these huge distributions, like a loggerhead sea turtle, we actually don't know these connections at a scale that's larger than potentially a a single season on a single beach. So taking that really mechanistic, equation-driven approach for sea turtles was not feasible, and was not necessarily the best approach for the questions that Park Service wanted answers to, namely how could they manage the beaches for future climate change. But because everyone loves sea turtles, and because these are Park Service beaches, we had this great data set at our disposal. So this is the example of, lots of data. And this is all of the nests for just loggerhead sea turtles across 5 parks, going from Cape Hatteras in the north down to the Everglades in the southern tip of Florida. And this is over 9,000 nests, and these are excavated nests. So what happens is all of these Park Service beaches are continuously monitored, starting a little bit before sea turtles probably will start nesting. And then every time a female sea turtle comes onto land, digs a nest, that nest is marked. And then either after the hatchlings emerge, which again is monitored and recorded, or after sufficient time has passed that is determined that those eggs probably won't hatch, the nests are dug up, and the number of successful hatchlings, the number of unsuccessful eggs, all of that information is recorded, as well as any disturbance events throughout that incubation period. So every time a nest is washed over, every time a raccoon digs it up, all of that information. So this is a huge data set. So thought, this number of nests, number of years, more importantly, we really have a lot of power here. So the first question, which I thought was straightforward and ended up being really non-trivial, was for all of our analyses, we really needed to figure out, what are we talking about in terms of the area? These are mostly spatial analyses, needs to be bounded in some way. So if we're thinking about a nesting location or a nesting beach, where do we define the edges of that space? So the high tide line makes sense on one side, but what about the other? Do we do it by dunes? These parks going from North Carolina to southern tip of Florida have very different dune formations. Dunes move from year to year. Where do you define where dunes start? Sea turtles nest on dunes, so maybe that actually isn't the best metric. Areas where humans have built things up, you may not even have dunes. So spent a lot of time thinking about this question, and in order to assess how sea level rise, how storm surge would affect nesting locations, we need to understand both where those areas are now and then where they will be in the future. So this question of where they'll be in the future comes up when we think about the fact that all of these examples, all of these 5 parks are all barrier islands. So we know that when sea level has changed in the past, these barrier islands have moved. These are not stable islands. They move. Sea turtles have been around for a very long time. They move with the beaches. So we assume that these nesting beaches will move with changing sea level. But what doesn't move is pavement. Though, as probably most of us have seen, it doesn't necessarily stand up to the power of a hurricane. We do have these issues of coastal squeeze, where In a natural system, we may find that the beaches move from year to year, changing sea level. But when we add these impervious surfaces, roads, houses, seawalls, we're impeding that natural beach movement. So you might be thinking, well, these are national parks. They look beautiful, pristine. Some of them do. So this is Cumberland Island National Seashore. The only way to get there is by boat. There's nothing built up along the beaches. But this is Cape Hatteras. So Cape Hatteras has all of these villages along the beaches. There are also roads that then connect those villages. So by looking for this study, we looked at actually across 4 parks. We did not look at the Everglades because we had not gotten those data yet. We had this nice gradient of how built up the beaches were. Still haven't solved where the sea turtles are nesting. So what I ended up turning to for that is what I was really interested in is what's the beach as relevant to a sea turtle? And if you look at where the sea turtles have nested historically, you notice that on every beach, they follow a really, really nice distribution. So this is Canaveral National Seashore, 4 years of nesting data. And then that's the histogram of the distance from the high water line. So what you can see is we have this really nice histogram. Most sea turtles are nesting about 30 meters from the high water line. And if we look across parks, we see this same trend. The actual distance, so where that peak is, varies by park because these are different barrier island formations. Some of them have really long, flat or wide flat beaches. Some are like Canaveral are much more condensed. Also some differences between species. Only in Canaveral do we look at 2 different species. So A and B up here are, A is loggerhead and then B is green sea turtles. So we can see, we've got the beach area. Now we're interested in, does rising sea level, are we going to see that coastal squeeze? Is it going to push, say, if the sea turtles are nesting in the first 40 meters of beach from the shoreline, is it pushing that area up into the roads? So I just did pretty simple, put it in GIS. So I took the current nesting area and then using a sea level rise bathtub model. So just assuming that the elevation stays the same, sea level goes up. We were working with Park Service who had a partner who was mapping sea level rise across all the parks. Very convenient. So what you can see here is in gray is a road. And then in the darker purple is the area that we think they will be nesting, loggerhead will be nesting in the future. This is at Canaveral, that most developed beach. And then this yellow is all of the area that if they're still nesting on that same beach width would be lost in the future. So you can see from this example that some of these roads do impede. Even if the beach moves to the other side of the road, we don't think the sea turtles are or should be crossing it. So we looked at this, like I said, across kind of a gradient of development. So Canaveral, or Cape Hatteras, that first one, is almost 100% shoreline developed. Cape Lookout, which is just that next little cape area down from Hatteras, has almost no development. Cumberland Island, like I showed, had no development. And then Canaveral National Seashore down in Florida. And I have here also, what we calculated as the area lost. What you'll notice is, as we expected, Cape Hatteras, with all those roads, did have some area lost, just around 5%, which is still pretty significant when these are pretty high producing beaches. You'll also notice is Cumberland Island, which has no development, also has almost 7% area loss. And that's because of the makeup of the island. There's substantial amount of the beach is a southern skinny portion. So with sea level rise, we're getting water up on both sides. So it ends up compressing some of those wide beaches in the south. And the other thing that I just want to mention is if we think about where sea turtles are currently nesting, Canaveral density is about 10 times, I think, the density of Hatteras and Lookout. So even that 1% loss for loggerhead or 2% loss for green sea turtles would have a much larger impact on the population than Cape Hatteras. But if we want to think about climate change, other factors besides sea level, those Cape Hatteras beaches may become higher producing beaches in the future. Sea turtles do shift where they're nesting. So those might become better habitat, which is the next part. So the next part of this grant was to predict changes in suitable nesting habitat for sea turtles. So we had to go back to this kind of much bigger picture if we wanted to get at those nesting outcomes. But again, you know, we didn't have the data available, or we didn't have the information available to directly model every single one of these connections. So if we want to know where nesting will likely be in the future, we can use those patterns of where nesting has been more or less successful in the past, and extrapolate that out in the future. This is why we pulled in that Everglades data set, because it seemed like having that South Florida where temperatures are currently higher than, say, North Carolina would be kind of a better proxy of getting that full suite of success, thinking about extreme temperatures and other events. So we used the information that we have from the single beach observational studies and the controlled experiments to come up with some hypotheses, which is how we end up with a figure like this to begin with, but then also think about it in terms of building a statistical model. So the first issue with most things that nest is if we look at nesting data, we have this really fun distribution to deal with where we have a lot of zeros. And knowing what we know about sea turtles and what happens to these nests on these beaches, we have reason to a priori believe that these zeros are probably from a different process than whatever generated the rest of this distribution. So the things that are causing total clutch failure are probably different than the things that are causing this other variation in the number of eggs. So what we developed was this hurdle model. So you can think of this as the first step being the turtles kind of failing to go over the hurdle. And then the second step would be all of those nests where the turtle successfully passed the hurdle. And what I'm going to focus on is this first part. So we broke this up, thinking of it as two separate models, because we think they're two separate processes, and it makes some of the analyses a little bit easier. So this clutch failure model then this is what we ended up with as using Bayesian models. So first modeling whether predation event happened, whether an inundation event happened to each nest, and then whether the nest had total clutch failure based off of if predation events happen, if flooding events happen, and then these other factors that have more to do with the development of the eggs. And we took this approach because predation doesn't always end in total clutch failure. Same with flooding. A nest can be flooded and still be successful. A nest can be consumed by a predator and still have some success. And both of these events can happen to a single very unlucky nest. And from this approach, we can look at a couple of different things. We can pull out certain variables and see how changing one or two variables in this model influences disturbance rates, influences clutch failure. So here's the probability of clutch failure, with 1 being all the clutches fail, 0 being all the clutches have at least some hatching. We only care if at least 1 turtle hatches. And ectotherms, it's too cold, we're not going to see any hatching. And then we have this quadratic relationship where we actually did recover that around 30 degrees is where we see this inflection point. And we have nests doing better and better and better until you hit 30 degrees and they start doing poorly again. This lines up with the literature of what people see in lab experiments. We also looked at the days over 90 degrees. This is collected for humans. So this is over a 2-month period during incubation. Corresponds pretty well to that failure rate. And then the other figure here looks at those 2 disturbance events. So a depredation event or an inundation event, as you move farther away from that high water line, stands to reason as you move farther away from the high water line, further up the beach, less chance of a nest getting flooded, but a higher chance of a predator disturbing the nest. Most of the predators in these systems are mammals. They're hanging out at the vegetation line, things like raccoons, coyotes, hogs. So that's why that increases. And because the parks sometimes put predator control on the nests, or they put a fence over the top, sometimes they don't, we have this nice juxtaposition where we can look at, what happens when you do, what happens when you don't do that predator exclusion. And here we have, some good takeaways from managers of like, if you only can fence some nests, which is true at some of these really dense nesting beaches, where do you get kind of the most bang for your buck in terms of fencing those nests? Similarly, if it's a beach where they do relocate nests to prevent inundation, again, where is that most successful? But this is looking at 1 or 2 variables at a time. And of course, the system is much more complicated than that. So what my real goal was, and what Park Service was interested in, is creating some sort of map. So we took these models, we applied them to the spatial data. And here again is inundation. So if this is the open ocean, inundation goes down as you get farther from the ocean. Depredation goes up, and then you see the far side, that clutch failure. And what is really interesting is you see that clutch failure is lowest in the areas where it's yellow, and that lines up really nicely with what we saw on those histograms, where you have a peak in where turtles are most successful at nesting in terms of clutch failure. and it corresponds pretty well with where they are nesting. So I am a climate change ecologist. So the real goal with this was, how can we look at how these things will change in the future? So we specifically picked variables where we have future downscaled climate model information, which means taking a slightly coarser approach to some of these climate variables. We were not modeling the temperature in every individual nest. Rather, we were using air temperature. It allowed us to process things at a much greater speed, much larger area, and also use these future conditions too. So this is what, my computer wasn't here. This is what would be running on my laptop right now, is generating those future layers. So even though my postdoc has ended 2 years ago, still working on this. So that'll be the next part of this, is looking at clutch failure into the future. So to kind of wrap up, what do we do when we've got all the time of a postdoc, all of the data of the National Park Service, but a really complicated system, so we have to develop some new approaches to answering the questions that ultimately are what Park Service was interested in. So we looked at how impervious surfaces may cause coastal squeeze. We were able to identify areas along those beaches where there might be more or less coastal squeeze. Honestly, a lot of these areas, the roads may need to get moved in the future anyway. So if we can identify places that, we also made maps of nesting density that I didn't talk about. So if we can identify some of those areas where kind of keeping down the human footprint would be better for the turtles, that's great. Similarly, if we can identify some of those areas now and into the future where the nesting turtles will be more successful, we can figure out some adaptive management for those areas, decrease foot traffic, change the amount of predator exclusion, of all of those things. So I think we created a model that really is useful, and Park Service ultimately was not displeased with what we did. So I would say that's a win. But for the final part, my talk today, I wanted to talk about, what do you do when your time is limited, when your access to data are limited, but these knowledge of climate impacts is as, or maybe more critical than that first section. So like Ken mentioned, taking this in a more qualitative framework by necessity, and what do we still kind of have the power within that to say and to do. So this is part of my current work. I'm currently an ecologist since 2020 with the USGS Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. This is one of 9 regional and 1 national science centers. We cover continental US, Alaska, and Pacific Islands, as well as the Caribbean. So the way these casks work, if you are haven't grown familiar with the Midwest one, is that each exists as a collaborative agreement between the US Geological Survey, which is the science branch of the Department of the Interior, where I'm employed, and a regional host university. So you all are up here, that little star, it's the University of Minnesota, is our regional host for the Midwest cask. So my office is over in the Institute on the Environment. That's where we're hosted out of. And in general, you can see here our CASC mission, which is delivering science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to changing climate. And in the Midwest, specifically, we engage with Department of Interior, states, tribal governments, and other natural and cultural resource managers to ensure information and tools are applied directly to adaptation decisions in the region. So that's our, our larger organization. I was specifically brought on to help with this project, supporting U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on species status assessments. So I was hired as an ecologist, and then we hired Kasha Nikhil, who's the climate impacts postdoc, and then Ryan Boyles, who's the deputy director for the Southeastern Climate Adaptation Science Center, and Olivia Ledee, who's the acting director for the Midwest CASC. So Olivia is a graduate of this program, and her office is also in IONE with me. So we started this project in 2020 to try and advance how climate change is incorporated into species status assessments. And species status assessments are one part of endangered species listing decisions. So the way that endangered species listing decisions work is you have a petition to list a species, followed by a 90-day finding, which basically evaluates based off of available information, whether or not the species should kind of continue in this workflow, whether there's substantial evidence that they should be considered for the Endangered Species Act listing. Then following that, you get a status review. So this is where the species status assessment comes in. And then after that, there's a 12-month finding based off of that species status assessment. And it's determined that a species is either warranted and a rule is published, not warranted, or warranted but precluded. So if you paid attention to the monarch, that was a warranted but precluded, meaning that it meets the criteria of an endangered or threatened species, but there's not enough funding or personnel to do that listing because of higher priority species. So this Fish and Wildlife Service, I work for US Geological Survey, and we really focus on the science that can be used to inform policy without directly advising on any policy or rulemaking. So it means that we kind of only sit in this center arrow, this status review. And these species status assessments then, which are the foundational science, each contain information on the species' life history, their habitat, taxonomy, their current condition, and then their future condition, which has to include response to probable future scenarios, which I'm sure you can anticipate is where climate change does come into play. Also comes into play often in the current species condition too. But the issue is the work plan for listing decisions is large. So this is now out of date because there's the 2022 to 2027, I think is the newest listing work plan. But these are all the species that need decisions before 2025. Most of them are based off of legal deadlines. So it's court ordered. Someone sued the service, come up with a date of when a decision needs to be made. So there's a lot of species that need this work. Climate change is going to probably impact most, if not all of them in some way. It's also very unevenly distributed. So we work all of the eastern, with all of the eastern US, so regions 3, 4, and 5. Since we know that climate change poses a significant threat, it needs to be considered for species on the listing work plan. But like I said, we've got limited time. We've got really complex interactions between climate and ecology going on for most of these species. And we've got some large knowledge gaps. So most of the species on the listing work plan are not monarchs. They're tiny crayfish that we may have very limited information on, but we still need to put forward the best available science. So what we've come in and done with our team has come in and done is thought about how can we synthesize existing data based off of literature and expert feedback on the species themselves, and then downscaled climate models that are directly relevant to those species, since that's really where our kind of expertise lies within USGS. So I see these as being beneficial and kind of two different sides. So the first is thinking about really data-rich species. This approach can be used to identify what mechanisms, what data sources are going to be most important if someone else has the capacity to do the modeling, which Fish and Wildlife Service is increasingly building up that capacity within the service. Also partners with academic institutions, and really identify what those climate change scenarios make most sense. For data poor species, we can describe those risk factors, and what's really important is the uncertainty and how that relates to climate change. So we can kind of hit these two sides of the spectrum and really apply this approach to any species. And we end up with these 6 to 20 page peer-reviewed summary documents. So the one I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail about, because it provides a nice juxtaposition to the sea turtles, are Blanding's turtles. Also done a lot of work on species that are not found in Minnesota, so I figured I'd highlight the species we're working on right now that is actually found in Minnesota. So Blanding's turtles, if you haven't encountered them or seen their nice yellow chins, have really complex life cycles. They rely on a mosaic of habitats, which can make them really under threat from landscape change, other climate change factors. And their habitat needs vary throughout the year and throughout their very long lives. There's been a lot of work on Blanding's turtles, but a lot of the work has been in kind of pockets of long-term research sites. And then this may seem kind of out of nowhere and doesn't track the rest of it, but there's heavy poaching pressures generally on freshwater turtles in the US. And this is a great concern for Blanding's turtle. And what it means is it's almost impossible for us to gather and compile data on these species because we are a federal organization, and any data that's used in a listing decision, even if we weren't a federal organization, then is subject to Freedom of Information Act request, which means that if someone sends us locality information, we can't assure them that we can shield that information from someone requesting to know exactly where Blanding's turtles occur so that they can scoop them up and sell them into the pet trade. Which sounds like a very abstract idea, but it actually does happen. It hasn't happened as much with the Freedom of Information Act request, but it is the reason that many journals won't publish locality information for any species where there's this concern, because it does happen. And just to further convince you that Minnesota really cares about Blanding's turtle, this was the front page of Minnesota Public Radio on Wednesday. I think kind of how many of your students now work on Blanding's turtle? There's like 3 of us. So these turtles are, one of the priority species for Fish and Wildlife Service for listing decisions. So why does this qualitative approach work? And what does it allow us to tackle that we otherwise wouldn't be able to tackle? So if we think, we made this very nice, this is actually the simplified version of those connections between our climate impacts, some other land use change, and then through these purple mechanisms down to kind of the green, which is what ultimately Fish and Wildlife Service cares about in terms of thinking about these populations in the future. So this is based off of an exhaustive literature search done primarily by Ellen Candler, who's another ConSci alum, who's been working with me for the past few months. So if we think about one of these climate impacts, so we think about changes in precipitation, and what are the cascading effects? Within the range of Blanding's turtle, we expect that precipitation will become increasingly more variable. We're already seeing that in Minnesota. We're cycling through these drought and deluge periods much more frequently. And if we wanted to, develop a model for these darker arrows, so like heavy precipitation events causing flooding, causing nest failure, and what that means for kind of the reproductive success of the species or of a population, we could probably do a decent job modeling that. That's what we did with the sea turtles. So if we had those data, we could look at that. We have very limited information though, but we could look at it. On the other side, we wanted to think about something like periods of drought causing loss of stopover habitat, which ultimately may make some turtles move farther, could increase road mortality. We see this in differences in how sex bias the adult turtle population is, presumably because in some areas with more roads, females are getting hit by cars more often than males that aren't journeying as far afield. This would be pretty difficult to directly model from Nebraska to Maine. So we can use this approach then to kind of describe what we think are the most important, where we would need more research in the future, but also identify, so Fish and Wildlife is doing some niche modeling work for this species. So this helps them identify which are those input variables, not just precipitation, but what part of precipitation probably matters the most for the turtles. So they're not going in blind. So in our reports, then, Kasha, who's the postdoc on this project, she's a physical scientist. Like this is what she does. So she's generates maps and other figures to describe how the landscape, how some of these populations may change in relevant ways to the turtles. This is a currently undergoing project, but we look, because uncertainty is really important in these situations, we're looking across global climate models. So trying to get those bookends of likely futures, and also the kind of the middle of the road too. So this is for a moderate emission scenario. So for RCP 4.5, and advancing in time, you can see that summer temperatures are going up. We know from some early lab experiments what the critical thermal maximum for these turtles are. And that's what this white, so in the kind of hottest future boxes that on the very bottom corner, those white areas then encircle like where we're exceeding that critical thermal max. And if I showed you the higher emission scenario, you would see that the white area is bigger. But the important thing is, you know, these are northern turtles. If I showed you the range map again, those white areas aren't getting into the current distribution. So we're unlikely to exceed the critical thermal max, but we are likely to have some of these other impacts on nests because the nests have different thermal thresholds. We're going to see some of these differences in heavy rainfall events. All of those more daily events are currently running on Kasia computer, which is why I don't have them to share. So these kind of more comprehensive accounts then really can identify data sources, ecologically relevant variables, describe it in these 10 to 15 page reports with these really nice figures that Kasia makes, and really incorporate a lot of aspects that we otherwise wouldn't be able to in a more quantitative approach. And these get, as I said, they're peer reviewed and they're published by USGS. So this is the first one we put out, which is on snail kites in the Everglades, another really well-studied species. I think every snail kite pretty much is monitored. Everyone knows where every single one of them is in the Everglades. The one of these that's about to come out that we just wrote is on 3 species of Appalachian stoneflies, which don't have a single published literature account. There's one white paper, and that's all we had to go on. So really spanning the data availability on those. So just to kind of wrap up, you know, for both of these systems, they're really different, these 2 different projects. But in both cases, we're really trying to use science, broadly defined, to inform wildlife management in a changing climate. So I think there's some like key larger takeaways that I would say, you know, as we all go out and try and do conservation work, really thinking about what do partners have the ability to do? What are they looking for information on? Thinking about Park Service, like what are the management factors that they're trying to do? What management actions are actually feasible? You have to be adaptable in your approach. We're working with natural systems and on tighter timelines than, you know, a PhD where you can actually go out and collect those data. You're dealing with kind of whatever is coming at you, really being adaptable and thinking about what the actual needs are. And then finally, you know, if you are working in this climate space, really thinking about climate and climate change in the context of what's relevant to species. So that's ultimately what we aim to do when we work with Fish and Wildlife Service, which is different than when our organization, we work with like Park Service on like broad changes to, say, an entire park. And yeah, with that, you know, I'm happy to take any and all questions. Yeah.
So I'm wondering with like both the species that you brought up, they both have nesting travel distances that vary. I don't know much about the sea turtles as much as you know, your data collection, obviously, but I'm curious with, I guess, both these species, if we see more natural disasters starting to come in, you know, your models, and hence what's going on right now too. And then, but also at the same time, more development patterns happening. Do you have any hypotheses about if more natural disasters might, you know, way could be helpful to open the door to, you know, potential like tunnels and different adaptive strategies to allow for conservation efforts? I know, like down in, okay, I guess I'm not supposed to say locations, but where's some landing turtles?
I mean, we know where all of them are. I mean, there's
Okay.
big signs everywhere that says like landing turtles are here. Yeah.
Yeah, so like where they do exist in
Mhm.
Minnesota, like there's a lot of push to kind of get tunnels underneath
Yep.
roads. So I don't know, do you have any predictions as far as that open more doors?
Yeah, so, you know, with Blanding's turtles, there's a lot of thought that a lot of them don't move very far, but some can move pretty large distances that, you know, these are long-lived species. They have dispersal ability. Will they start shifting north? We know that that's where the kind of the ideal climate for them will shift north. So yeah, so the work that like Chris Smith is doing for Minnesota DOT and Tricia Markle at the zoo, looking at where to put those kind of corridors and increase connectivity, I think is going to be pretty important for a lot of these terrestrial species. Something like sea turtles, we always have this idea that they, you know, they hatch on a beach and they come back to that beach and they only nest on that beach. And that's true for some. But when they've gone out and looked either at the individual turtles or looked at microsatellites, there's actually a lot more movement between beaches than you might think. So from the natural disaster side, right? Like if we start having more higher intensity hurricanes in Florida that overlap with nest incubation, those nests are wiped out, you know, that's not going into the gene pool. So if those North Carolina nests are more successful and those hatchlings then grow up, some number of them, and come back to the beaches, you could have shifts in the distribution that way. That might be, I think in both cases, whether it's natural disaster or, you know, human caused disturbance, again, these things tend to also together. You could have some of these shifts. The question is, are we warming things up too fast? So sea turtles, we know, have moved great distances, so they may be more able to kind of shift than something like a Blanding's turtle. We have some questions in the chat too. So Sam asks, what do you think can we do to improve the ability to develop mechanistic models for data deficient species other than just collect the data? Is the answer a trait-based analysis? So that's a great question. I think there's a lot of potential power in taking these overlapping approaches. So not going in saying, I will only do like a correlative model, or I'll only do a mechanistic model, but using what we know about mechanisms to potentially inform a statistical model, for example, or use, Ken and I have talked a lot about like using some of the output of where we know some mechanisms and using that to kind of build the layers that then go into a correlative model. So I think for some of these, taking a hybrid approach, potentially using the evolutionary tree to think about where are there well-studied species that we actually have some of this knowledge on. So for those salamanders, some species are really well studied and some are not. So figuring out where we can use the well-studied species to apply to some of these more data deficient and rare. Lucas asks, building off Sam's question, how does funding sources influence the ability to develop models? Are there creative ways to highlight less represented species within data collection for more charismatic species? You know, I work primarily for a funding agency. So besides what I do for the Midwest CASC, most of what we do is fund research. And I would say that we really prioritize species that are regionally of greatest conservation concern, which are not charismatic, the big charismatic species, because we've figured out a lot of things about them. We want people to go out and do work on freshwater mussels, which can be charismatic, or you know, a lot of the species on the National Listing Work Plan are really understudied freshwater species, and that's a lot of what we're funding. That's a lot of what Fish and Wildlife is funding. So I think, you know, if you look at organizations beyond kind of the first ones maybe that you think of, there is a lot of interest in funding that. So I don't think, if anything, I would say less charismatic species are often our priority. We do also put a big priority on culturally significant species in the Midwest, which sometimes overlaps a little bit more with those charismatic species. So things like funding projects for like moose, for example, or trout, I would say fit into that. I think it's one, so.
Yeah, maybe time for one more quick
Yep.
question. How heavy is the lining turtle poaching, are there estimates, and how does that compare to roadkill?
I think it's not, most of what I've seen is just freshwater turtles in general, and then kind of what the market rate is. They're mostly pet traded. What I've seen is mostly pet trade in Asia and the more rare species. You get enough for them that it's worth the fine if you get caught, is what I would say. So I think right now it's more of a, at least for Blanding's turtle, it's more of an abstract concern. Road mortality is definitely, so it's this question with Freedom of Information Act is how much are we being limited in our ability to put out effective conservation measures by, we need an act of Congress to change that as well. Park
So you
Service.
think more are killed on the roads than.
Yeah, I would guess that. Park Service, so the reason I can have all the sea turtle data, Park Service lands are exempt from FOIA locality requests. So.
Let's thank Marta for a great talk.